Welcome to Understand with Unbabel, a series where we dive deep into the issues, topics, and challenges facing us as we accelerate to a world without language barriers. Today I'm joined by Kim Harris, who's 20 years of experience in language services and localization, make her an ideal guest for our sofa today. She is co-founder of the Berlin-based language service provider text&form. She's a member of the Rosetta Foundation Advisory Board and a member of the editorial board for the European Commission's Translation Initiative. So, welcome to Unbabel.
Thank you very much.
So Kim, you obviously have been hugely active in the industry. What is it that first interested you in these fields, and how did you come to be involved in it?
Well, I've always loved languages. Being Canadian, I had to take French in school, but I did enjoy it, and then started learning German and moved to Germany in order to continue my studies. And as a student, I had a job working in a computer store, and I had the opportunity to translate some software for a UK company, and really enjoyed it. And I've been translating ever since.
So you founded your agency text&form way back in 1996. Mm-hmm. What kind of changes have you seen in the industry over the past 21 years?
How much time do we have, Matt? So when we started the company in 1996, we had an AOL account as our email account. There were no such things as domains for small companies like ours. You couldn't send files by email, let alone by anything. Even modem was sometimes quite difficult. It was a much slower pace back then as well. So translating meant translating files in systems such as SDL Trados, but the platforms were different. It was slower. When we got the files back, we would send them by mail and get CDs back by mail for testing. And of course, machine translation was not accessible at all. It existed, but it wasn't used at all.
Well, tell us more about that. I mean, what was the state of machine translation in the mid-90s versus today, I guess?
I mean, it did exist. There were systems such as Metal, but they were used essentially for very large jobs and very large localization companies that were able to implement them. But most small companies didn't even know that machine translation existed. And even the translation memory systems that were being used were very cumbersome and very slow. And when we tried, for example, to work with pricing with our customers, we always had to take that into consideration, which you don't today. So it's a much different world. Awareness of the things that we do now is also much greater.
So would you say more companies now are finding in the past 10 years that they need to internationalize versus the previous 10 years? Is that a...
Absolutely. You'll see as well, what I've seen, at least in my work, is that the quality that is coming out is much higher than it used to be. I think the awareness of good language has increased immensely, and that because the competition within certain countries is quite high, if you can't keep up with the people who speak the native language and sell in their native language, then you're not going to be able to sell to that market. And many companies have come to realize that if they don't provide quality information in the languages of the region in which they want to sell, that they won't be able to sell because they can't compete with those who do. So if your product is similar to another product, people are more willing to take cuts in some of the features rather than in the language, and this has been proven over and over again. So 10 years ago, if you had a website in Germany, your website would be in German and in English. And essentially, anyone who had a website outside of an English-speaking country would also have had their website in English. It was not good for business if you didn't have it in English. Nowadays, you have to have your website in the languages of your regions. So your markets, if you want to access your markets, then you need to have your website in these languages. And people have come to realize that English isn't enough. If you want to sell your product in China, you need to have your website in Chinese because there are too many other companies out there who are doing the same thing.
That's a really good point, and obviously having your website in the languages of the markets makes common sense. But what happens when customers start to interact with you in those languages?
Well, that's a good question. A lot of companies, of course, aren't ready to handle anything in a language other than English and the language of their corporate language. For that, they have, of course, companies like ours to help them with translation, but nothing that is spontaneous necessarily. So any of the user-generated content that comes in will need to be handled in a certain way. But this is very new. So this is a new area that needs to be dealt with, because everyone wants this information quickly, but you can't translate user-generated content by humans quickly. So you need to start looking at solutions.
So a big theme of the research, some of the research that you've done, is in quality standards and metrics. Mm-hmm. Now, in our experience, there's a real big gulf between academic, measurements of how that should be versus, customer expectations. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit about that gulf in your experience?
About the gulf in my experience. So the methods that are developed in research are important because without them, of course, we wouldn't have any of the tools that we have today anyway. But the problem is now that with a lot of these methods, we're finding that they aren't applicable to industry directly. So when we look at machine translation, quality estimation, or evaluation, the scores, the blue scores, the TER scores, or anything that is automated, it doesn't give us enough information to be able to use in industry to apply it to improving the quality of the output and the content. And this is part of the problem that we're trying to work on now with research, is to find ways of collaborating so that we can take the results that we're getting from research and actually apply them to what we do on a daily basis. And we're finding some progress with that, but it is tough sometimes to make researchers understand that it is important that the people who are actually also doing their evaluations are people who understand what it means to translate.
Kim, could you tell us a bit more about your involvement with the European Commission's Directorate General for Translation?
Sure. So for the past 8 years, I've been involved in what is called the LIND Expert Group. And essentially what the DGT wanted to do was to make more people aware of the need for translation and where they can find information on language and their own languages and industry throughout government in all of the European Union. We found that to be a difficult challenge working with the European Union because it is very bureaucratic, but what we have done is we have started an event called the Translating Europe Forum, which is held every year in November, and it brings together government and industry and translators in one place in Brussels every year to discuss the challenges of working together. So how things have changed, including technology, and how translators can be integrated more into the system, working with some of these new technologies that the European Union is working on. So it's quite exciting.
Do you think language is a barrier to economic growth in the European Union?
Absolutely. If you look at the statistics, 95% of all companies in the European Union are SMEs, so small to medium-sized enterprises. And these companies desperately need access to languages in order to be able to sell their products and services across borders. This is difficult for them if they can only rely on human translation, often because it's just prohibitively expensive for them to translate into 24 languages. So if they did have access to more languages in order to be able to sell their services, meaning shopping online or access to certain types of audio services, then I do believe that economic growth in the European Union would improve.
So it's no wonder then that the millions in funding that have come from the European Union for things like machine translation, are coming from a place of need. Can you tell us a bit about where you see the application of machine translation commercially and how that's been developing?
So this is also part of the conundrum between research, technology development, and translators, or the translation industry, actually. We see the need for tools that allow us to translate more quickly. And now we have to be looking at tools that are fit for purpose as well. So MT fits a lot of purposes. And it's difficult sometimes for the translation industry to accept that we do need these tools in order to be able to continue to grow the industry, because many people see it as a threat instead of seeing it as something that will actually help them grow their business. It is difficult because machine translation is not easily accessible. There aren't very many out-of-the-box solutions there. You can't generally use it on smaller projects. You need a lot of data. And a lot of smaller companies don't have a lot of data. So it is a bit prohibitive to them to be able to use these tools. So we need to be looking at more acceptance of the tools and a much easier access to the tools as well.
So every day it seems, or at least to me, it feels like there's some new story from one of the big tech giants saying that they've solved translation. Do you see a day where, some big tech company flips a switch and translation is solved?
Short answer, no. But that said, I do think that technology plays a huge role in the future, but I don't think that it will ever replace translators. There are too many different types of content that need translation, some of which can be translated by machines and will be in the future, but language is much too diverse for it to ever replace a human translator.
So yeah, looking ahead, say for the next decade, what are some of the trends or developments that you find the most exciting in these fields?
So for me, there are three parts to that. The first part is the collaboration between research and industry in order to really get some progress on adapting a lot of the research results we're seeing to be used in industry much more widely than they are now. The other is the role of the industry itself in this. So what sort of jobs translators will be doing, because they won't only be translating in the future. And the third one, and I think it will be the most important one, is being able to adapt technology to fit the purpose. So if you can develop technology that actually can adapt itself to the purpose for which it's being used in translation, then that will have a huge impact on the market, because as we've seen, there are a lot of purposes nowadays for content. You have high-end content on your website or in marketing materials. You have your user-generated content, which doesn't need to be quite as quality-driven, and you have other content that needs quality, but you can live with certain restrictions. As for the roles of translators in the future, I think that I see it as more of a community effort than a Lone Ranger effort in the future. I think that translators will specialize their roles. They will have to in order to be able to keep up with the market. With the development of technology, there will be specific roles to be played. This includes terminology management, post-editing, collaboration, management. Because the jobs are getting smaller, that means that the teams are getting bigger.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sitting down with us today, Kim.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're very, very welcome. This has been another episode of Understand with Unbabel. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.